Hey guys, tonight we begin with a room that most people never think about, but that shaped the fate of empires. The royal kitchen. Not the gleaming showcase spaces where celebrity chefs perform for cameras today, but the smoke-filled, sweltering, politically charged environments where medieval and early modern cooks transformed raw materials into power. In these kitchens, cinnamon wasn't just a spice, it was a statement about global reach, diplomatic connections, and the ability to command resources that most people would never taste in their entire lives. And smoke wasn't just a cooking technique, it was preservation technology, flavor engineering, and sometimes a weapon. This is the story of how what happened in royal kitchens mattered far beyond the dining table. The king's cook held a position of extraordinary trust and considerable danger. Trust because he controlled what entered the king's body at every meal, an obvious vulnerability in an age of political assassination through poison. Danger because if the king fell ill after eating, the cook was the first suspect, regardless of actual guilt. The royal kitchen was simultaneously one of the most powerful positions a commoner could hold and one of the most precarious. A successful royal cook could amass wealth, influence marriages, and shape diplomatic relationships. An unsuccessful one could lose his hands, his tongue, or his life. The physical space of a medieval royal kitchen was nothing like what modern people imagine when they hear the word kitchen. These were industrial operations, often housed in separate buildings to reduce fire risk to the main palace structures. Multiple hearths blazed continuously, tended by teams of specialized workers. Smoke filled the upper reaches of high-ceilinged rooms, designed to draw fumes upward and out through vents or louvers. The heat was intense enough to be dangerous. Kitchen workers regularly suffered burns, and the risk of fire was constant, despite every precaution. This was food production at scale, feeding not just the royal family, but the entire court, which might number in the hundreds or even thousands. The hierarchy within royal kitchens was as rigid and complex as the hierarchy of the court itself. At the top stood the master cook, or chief cook, who might never actually touch food himself, but who planned menus, managed supplies, supervised subordinates, and bore ultimate responsibility for every dish that left the kitchen. Below him were specialized cooks for different types of food. The sauce cook, the roast cook, the pastry cook, each commanding their own teams and jealously guarding their particular expertise. Below them were the workers who did the actual labor, turners of spits, haulers of water, scrubbers of pots, choppers of vegetables. At the very bottom were children, often as young as 8 or 9, who performed the most menial tasks and absorbed the knowledge that might eventually elevate them through the ranks. Before we continue, let me ask something. If you're the kind of person who finds the politics of medieval kitchens genuinely fascinating, who wants to know how cinnamon became a tool of statecraft and smoke became a technology of power, you're exactly who I make these videos for. Take a moment to subscribe if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments, what's the most expensive spice in your kitchen right now, and do you have any idea where it actually comes from? I'm genuinely curious. The spices that passed through royal kitchens represented the most valuable trade goods in the medieval world, and cinnamon stood near the top of the hierarchy. True cinnamon came from Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and reached European kitchens only after passing through a chain of middlemen that spanned the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Peninsula, the Mediterranean, and finally overland routes to northern European courts. Each link in this chain added markup. By the time cinnamon reached a kitchen in London or Paris, it had multiplied in price dozens of times over its cost at origin. A small quantity of cinnamon might represent more value than a labourer earned in a year. The astronomical cost of cinnamon and other spices wasn't simply a matter of transport difficulty, though the logistics were genuinely challenging. The cost reflected monopoly control at various points in the supply chain, deliberate mystery about origins maintained by traders who didn't want competition, and the irreducible fact that spices came from specific places that couldn't be easily replicated. You couldn't grow cinnamon in England no matter how much you wanted to. The only way to have it was to participate in trade networks that stretched across the known world, which required wealth, connections, and the kind of political stability that made long-distance commerce possible. The presence of cinnamon at a royal feast sent unmistakable messages. It demonstrated that the king commanded resources from the far corners of the earth, that his trade connections were intact and functioning, that his treasury was healthy enough to afford extravagance. The absence of expected spices sent equally clear messages. Something had gone wrong. Trade routes were disrupted, diplomatic relationships had soured, finances were strained. Rival courts watched each other's spice consumption as one indicator among many of relative power and stability. The kitchen was an arena of international competition. The use of cinnamon in royal cooking went far beyond simple flavouring. Medieval and early modern cooks used spices in quantities that modern palates would find overwhelming, partly because heavily spiced food was associated with wealth and sophistication, partly because spices had medicinal reputations that made them seem health-promoting, and partly because strong flavours masked any off-notes in ingredients that weren't perfectly fresh. A dish well spiced was a dish prepared properly. A dish without adequate spicing was cheap, common, and potentially dangerous. The recipes that survive from royal kitchens reveal cinnamon appearing in contexts that might surprise modern cooks. Meat dishes were routinely seasoned with cinnamon, creating flavour profiles that contemporary Western cuisine has largely abandoned. Fish preparations featured cinnamon alongside ingredients we would now consider incompatible. Sweet and savoury weren't the distinct categories they've become. Medieval cuisine mixed flavours freely, and cinnamon moved between applications without the boundary policing that modern cooking applies. The spice was versatile precisely because it was precious. You didn't waste cinnamon by limiting its use. The storage of valuable spices like cinnamon was a matter of considerable security. In many royal households, spices were kept under lock and key, with access restricted to senior kitchen officials who could be held accountable for inventory. The spice cupboard or spice room was treated more like a treasury than a pantry. Regular accounting tracked consumption, and discrepancies triggered investigations. Spice theft was a serious offence, prosecuted not merely as theft, but as a form of betrayal of the royal trust. The cooks who controlled spice access wielded genuine power within the kitchen hierarchy. The procurement of spices connected royal kitchens to vast commercial networks that the cooks themselves rarely understood in full. A master cook might specify that he needed a certain quantity of cinnamon for an upcoming feast, but the actual acquisition involved merchants, factors, ship captains, warehouse keepers, and financial instruments that the cook never saw. The kitchen consumed what commerce provided, and when commerce failed, when ships were lost, when wars disrupted trade routes, when plague closed ports, the kitchen suffered. Supply chain management wasn't a concept medieval cooks would have recognized by that name, but they experienced its reality constantly. The relationship between cinnamon and political negotiation was sometimes explicit. Diplomatic gifts frequently included spices, with the quality and quantity calibrated to the importance of the relationship. A particularly generous gift of cinnamon signalled serious diplomatic interest. A perfunctory amount signalled mere courtesy. Treaties sometimes included provisions about trade access that directly affected spice availability. The kitchen's needs influenced foreign policy, and foreign policy influenced what the kitchen could serve. The intersection was rarely discussed openly, but everyone involved understood it. The fraud and adulteration that plagued the spice trade created constant problems for royal kitchens seeking authentic ingredients. Unscrupulous merchants stretched valuable spices with cheaper substitutes, passed off inferior varieties as premium grades, or simply lied about origins. Cassia, a cinnamon relative from China, was frequently sold as true Ceylon cinnamon, and detecting the substitution required expertise that not all purchasers possessed. Royal kitchens developed relationships with trusted suppliers and employed tasters and experts who could identify authentic spices, but the problem never fully disappeared. The value of spices created irresistible incentives for cheating. Smoke, the other element in our story, played an entirely different but equally important role in royal food systems. Where cinnamon was about display and international connection, smoke was about transformation and preservation. Before refrigeration, keeping meat edible for more than a few days required techniques that modern people rarely encounter: salting, drying, and smoking. Smoke exposure changed food chemically, killing bacteria and creating an environment hostile to spoilage. A properly smoked ham could last for months. An unsmoked one would rot within days. This wasn't merely convenient, it was the difference between eating through winter and starving. The smoking of food happened in dedicated facilities that were distinct from the main cooking kitchens. Smokehouses were specialized buildings designed to expose food to controlled smoke over extended periods, sometimes days or weeks. The wood chosen for smoking mattered enormously. Different woods imparted different flavors, and experienced smoke masters knew which woods worked best for which foods. Oak was common for general smoking. Fruit woods like apple and cherry were prized for delicate applications. Resinous woods were generally avoided because they could make food taste of turpentine. The expertise was genuine and valued. Royal households maintained elaborate smoking operations that processed enormous quantities of meat, fish, and other foods. The scale was necessary because courts were large and because preservation allowed accumulation of resources against uncertain futures. A king with well-stocked smokehouses was a king who could survive sieges, endure supply disruptions, and feed allies through difficult times. The strategic dimension of food preservation wasn't lost on anyone. Controlling preserved food supplies was military power as surely as controlling weapons. The personnel who managed smoking operations often held positions distinct from the main kitchen hierarchy. The smoke master, or smoking supervisor, had specialized knowledge that general cooks didn't share, and that knowledge created its own power base within the household. Conflicts between kitchen and smokehouse were common, as each claimed authority over different aspects of food production. The integration of smoked products into kitchen operations required coordination that didn't always come naturally to specialists jealous of their own domains. The flavor impact of smoking on medieval cuisine was pervasive in ways modern people rarely appreciate. When preserved meat was the norm rather than the exception, smoke flavor was simply what meat tasted like for much of the year. Fresh meat was a seasonal luxury, available only during slaughter periods or through hunting. The rest of the time, people ate what had been preserved, and that meant smoked, salted, or dried. The taste preferences that developed around preserved foods shaped cuisine for centuries, and traces remain in modern dishes that incorporate smoke flavor for taste rather than preservation necessity. The combination of cinnamon and smoke in royal cooking created flavor profiles that were characteristic of the era. Heavily spiced preparations using smoked meats integrated both elements, producing dishes that struck balances between the sweet, warm notes of cinnamon and the savory, sharp notes of smoke. These weren't accidental combinations, they were deliberate constructions by cooks who understood how flavors interacted and who had the resources to deploy expensive ingredients alongside preserved necessities. The cuisine of royal kitchens was sophisticated precisely because it had access to the full range of available materials. The knowledge systems that supported royal cooking were transmitted primarily through apprenticeship rather than through written recipes. Young workers in royal kitchens learned by watching, by doing, by absorbing tacit knowledge that couldn't easily be put into words. How long to smoke a particular cut? How much cinnamon to add to a particular sauce? When a roast was done? These judgments developed through years of experience that no book could fully capture. The master cooks who possessed this knowledge were genuinely irreplaceable, and they knew it, which gave them bargaining power within household hierarchies. Written recipes did exist, and the manuscripts that survive from royal and noble households provide invaluable evidence of what kitchens actually produced. But these recipes were often more like memory aids for experienced cooks than instructions for novices. Quantities were vague or absent, techniques were assumed rather than explained. Ingredients were listed without full specification of type or quality. A modern cook trying to recreate medieval dishes from these recipes faces enormous interpretive challenges. The recipes recorded outcomes, not processes, trusting that readers would know how to achieve results that the text merely described. The economics of royal kitchens connected them to every level of the food supply system. At the base, agricultural producers grew grains, raised animals, and cultivated gardens that eventually supplied palace kitchens. Above them, merchants and factors accumulated supplies, transported goods, and maintained the commercial relationships that kept provisions flowing. At the household level, stewards and pursers managed budgets, approved expenditures, and audited accounts. The kitchen consumed what all these systems provided, and consumption patterns drove demand that rippled backward through the entire chain. A royal preference for cinnamon-spiced dishes increased cinnamon demand, enriched cinnamon merchants, and ultimately affected farmers in Ceylon, who would never see the palaces where their product was consumed. The waste produced by royal kitchens was itself economically significant. Scraps that couldn't be served at the royal table were distributed according to established protocols, first to servants of various ranks, then to the poor who gathered at palace gates for exactly this purpose. The right to receive kitchen waste was valuable enough to be contested, and the distribution created social relationships that extended the kitchen's influence far beyond its physical boundaries. A cook who controlled waste distribution controlled a form of patronage that ordinary people would seek and value. The fire risk that kitchens posed to palace complexes was a constant concern that shaped architectural decisions across Europe. Many palaces located their kitchens in separate buildings connected to main halls by covered passages, accepting the inconvenience of distance in exchange for reduced risk that kitchen fires would spread to residential or ceremonial spaces. The Great Fire of London in 1666 started in a bakery, not a palace kitchen, but the principle was the same. Concentrated fire use in food preparation created dangers that prudent builders took seriously. Kitchen design was as much about fire management as about food production. The religious dimensions of royal cooking affected every aspect of kitchen operations. Christian dietary laws required abstaining from meat on designated days, which might total more than a third of the year when all fasting periods were observed. This meant royal kitchens had to maintain dual capabilities: meat-based cooking for ordinary days and fish-based cooking for fast days. The fish kitchen was a distinct operation within larger establishments, with its own staff, its own suppliers, and its own expertise. The alternation between meat and fish rhythms structured the kitchen year, and the resources required to maintain both capabilities were substantial. The theatrical dimension of royal dining made kitchen work visible to audiences in ways that modern restaurant cooking rarely matches. Elaborate presentations, structured courses, ceremonial serving, all of these required coordination between kitchen and hall that involved timing, communication, and shared understanding of how feasts should unfold. The kitchen didn't simply produce food, it produced performances, with dishes serving as props in displays of royal magnificence. A failed dish wasn't just bad cooking, it was failed theatre, embarrassing the king before assembled witnesses. The cinnamon that arrived from distant lands and the smoke that rose from local wood both contributed to performances that made royal power tangible. Guests who tasted the results understood, without needing explicit explanation, that they were consuming wealth and capability. The kitchen translated abstract power into sensory experience, making political claims that speeches and documents couldn't convey. In this translation lay the kitchen's true importance, not merely feeding bodies, but impressing minds. The fires are burning and the spices are ready. The next part of our story will explore how royal kitchens actually operated day to day, what happened when things went wrong, and how the cinnamon and smoke cuisine of palaces spread to influence cooking far beyond royal tables. The aroma of something rich is rising from the hearth. Let's continue. The daily operations of a royal kitchen began long before the king woke and continued long after he slept. The hearth fires that would roast the day's meat had to be lit hours before cooking commenced, building the beds of coals that sustained even heat. Water had to be drawn, carried, and heated. Bread baking started before dawn so that fresh loaves would be ready for morning service. The kitchen never truly stopped. It merely cycled through different phases of activity as the day progressed. The workers who staffed these operations developed rhythms of labor that structured their entire lives around the demands of continuous food production. The hierarchy of kitchen labor was enforced through both formal authority and physical violence. Master cooks controlled their domains through a combination of expertise, social status, and the credible threat of physical punishment for subordinates who failed to perform adequately. Kitchen workers were struck, burned, and beaten with a casualness that modern employment law would find shocking. The heat, the sharp implements, the constant pressure of time, all of these created environments where tempers ran hot and discipline was maintained through fear as much as respect. This wasn't dysfunction. It was standard practice, accepted by everyone involved as simply how kitchens operated. The physical toll on kitchen workers was enormous. The combination of extreme heat, heavy lifting, long hours, and dangerous equipment guaranteed that injuries were constant. Burns were so common that experienced cooks bore scars as marks of their trade. Cuts from knives and cleavers happened regularly. Infections followed frequently. The smoke that preserved food also damaged lungs, and workers who spent decades in smoky kitchens developed respiratory problems that shortened their lives. Kitchen work was genuinely dangerous, and the workers who survived long enough to achieve mastery had paid for their knowledge with their bodies. The coordination required to produce a major royal feast tested every aspect of kitchen organization. Dozens of dishes had to reach the appropriate temperature and doneness simultaneously, ready for service in a sequence that the hall expected. The timing was brutal. Meat that arrived at the table cold or overcooked represented failure, and failure was punished. Master cooks developed systems for managing this complexity, assigning specific tasks to specific workers, establishing communication protocols between sections, rehearsing sequences of actions that had to flow smoothly under pressure. The best cooks were essentially project managers who could coordinate dozens of parallel processes toward a single deadline. The role of cinnamon in this coordination extended beyond its flavor contribution. Cinnamon was expensive enough that its use had to be authorized and tracked, which meant that dishes containing cinnamon followed different administrative pathways than dishes without. The cook who reached for the cinnamon had to be someone trusted with access to valuable spices, which limited who could work on cinnamon-containing preparations. This administrative reality shaped kitchen workflow, concentrating certain tasks among senior personnel while delegating others to junior workers. The hierarchy of ingredients reinforced the hierarchy of labor. The sourcing of cinnamon and other spices was an ongoing concern that occupied senior household officials beyond the kitchen itself. Maintaining reliable merchants, negotiating prices, arranging transport, verifying quality, all of these activities happened at levels above the cook's direct authority, but directly affected what the cook could accomplish. A disruption in the spice supply chain might not be the cook's fault, but it was certainly the cook's problem. The master cook had to maintain awareness of supply conditions and adjust menus accordingly, substituting available ingredients when preferred ones weren't obtainable. The master cook had to maintain awareness of supply conditions and adjust menus accordingly, substituting available ingredients when preferred ones weren't obtainable. The quality control challenges around cinnamon were persistent and difficult. Even experienced spice merchants might not be able to distinguish true Ceylon cinnamon from cassia by sight alone, and the differences in flavour were subtle enough that only trained palates caught them reliably. Royal households employed tasters and experts specifically to evaluate spice quality, but their judgments weren't infallible. Disputes between merchants and households over spice quality were common, and the resolution of these disputes revealed the power dynamics between commercial and royal interests. A merchant who habitually sold inferior spices to a royal household might find his commercial relationships damaged beyond the specific transaction. The smoking operations that supported royal kitchens operated on seasonal rhythms that the main kitchen didn't share. Slaughter of livestock concentrated in autumn, when animals were fattest and when the coming cold weather made preservation more effective. The weeks following slaughter were periods of intense smoking activity, as fresh meat was processed for storage before it could spoil. Smokehouses operated continuously during these periods, with workers monitoring fires and rotating products around the clock. The preserved meat that resulted would sustain the household through winter and into spring, until fresh provisions became available again. If you're finding this exploration of how royal kitchens actually functioned, the logistics, the labour, the constant problem-solving, genuinely interesting, that's exactly why I make these videos. The subscribe button is there if you want more of these moments where the past suddenly becomes vivid and real. The fuel requirements for smoking operations were substantial enough to affect forest management across royal estates. Oak and other hardwoods suitable for smoking didn't grow overnight. They required decades of cultivation before harvest. Royal foresters managed woodland resources with an eye toward future smoking needs, balancing current harvest against long-term sustainability. The same forests that provided smoking fuel also provided construction timber, heating fuel, and numerous other products, creating allocation conflicts that household administrators had to resolve. Food preservation competed with other needs for finite forest resources. The flavour profiles achieved through smoking varied based on techniques that smoke masters refined over generations. Cold smoking, which exposed food to smoke at low temperatures over extended periods, produced different results than hot smoking, which cooked and smoked simultaneously. The duration of exposure, the density of smoke, the moisture content of the wood, the temperature gradients within the smokehouse, all of these variables could be adjusted to achieve specific outcomes. The best smoke masters understood their craft intuitively, making adjustments based on observation and experience that they couldn't fully articulate but could reliably execute. The integration of smoked products into kitchen cooking required understanding how smoking had changed the ingredients. Smoked meat didn't cook the same way as fresh meat. It required different techniques and different timing. The salt content in most smoked products affected seasoning decisions throughout a dish. The smoke flavor itself had to be balanced against other flavors, neither overwhelming them nor being overwhelmed. Cooks who worked with smoked ingredients developed specialized knowledge that wasn't automatically transferable from experience with fresh ingredients. The kitchen and the smokehouse represented different knowledge domains that had to be bridged. The poison threat that shadowed royal dining shaped kitchen operations in ways that weren't always visible to outsiders. The possibility that someone might try to kill the king through his food was taken seriously, and countermeasures were built into kitchen procedures. Tasters sampled dishes before service, accepting personal risk to verify safety. Secure storage prevented unauthorized access to ingredients. Surveillance of kitchen workers aimed to detect suspicious behavior. These precautions added complexity and cost to kitchen operations, but the stakes, the king's life, justified whatever burden they imposed. The investigation protocols that activated when a king fell ill after eating revealed how seriously poison threats were taken. Every person who had handled the suspect food was detained and questioned, sometimes under torture. Every ingredient was traced back through the supply chain, seeking the point where poison might have been introduced. The cook was always a prime suspect, regardless of his reputation or record, simply because he had the greatest opportunity to introduce harmful substances. These investigations could destroy careers and end lives, even when no actual poisoning had occurred. Food-related illness from natural causes was difficult to distinguish from deliberate poisoning, and suspicion itself was damaging. The relationship between royal kitchens and the medical understanding of the time was closer than modern people might expect. Food was considered medicine in medieval and early modern thinking. What you ate directly affected your health in ways that required careful management. Cinnamon was valued partly for its supposed medicinal properties, warming, digestive, restorative, and its inclusion in royal dishes wasn't purely about flavor. The cook who planned menus was expected to consider the king's health, adjusting preparations to address whatever imbalances the royal physicians had identified. Kitchen and medicine overlapped in ways that modern specialization has obscured. The preservation of medical considerations extended to smoke and smoked foods. Smoke was believed to have purifying properties that extended beyond simple preservation. Smoked meat was considered healthier than fresh meat in certain contexts, more suitable for particular constitutions or conditions. The smoke itself was sometimes used medicinally, with patients exposed to wood smoke in attempts to treat various ailments. The boundaries between food, medicine, and treatment were porous, and the kitchen participated in health management as part of its broader functions. The diplomatic dimensions of royal dining meant that kitchen performance could affect international relations. A feast for visiting dignitaries that failed to impress could damage negotiations. A feast that exceeded expectations could create goodwill that facilitated agreement. The kitchen received intelligence about guests' preferences and restrictions, adjusting menus to accommodate foreign tastes while still displaying the host court's capabilities. These adjustments required flexibility and knowledge of other culinary traditions that cosmopolitan master cooks developed through experience with diverse guests. The gift economy of spices intersected with diplomatic dining in complex ways. A visiting ambassador might bring cinnamon as a gift, which the host kitchen would then incorporate into dishes served to the ambassador himself, completing a circle of reciprocity that both parties understood. The quality of gifted spices sent messages about the giver's wealth and the importance assigned to the relationship. Receiving inferior spices as a gift was mildly insulting. Receiving exceptional spices was flattering. The kitchen staff had to navigate these subtleties, making appropriate use of gifted ingredients while maintaining the household's own spice standards. The written records that survive from royal kitchens provide snapshots of operations that must be interpreted carefully. Account books record purchases and expenditures, but they don't explain how purchases were used or why particular decisions were made. Menus describe what was served, but they don't reveal the labor required to produce each dish or the problems encountered along the way. The documentary record emphasizes certain aspects of kitchen life, the expensive, the unusual, the problematic, while leaving routine operations invisible. Reconstructing daily kitchen practice from these records requires reading between lines and filling gaps with informed speculation. The recipes that survive from royal contexts often reflect aspirational standards rather than daily practice. Elaborate dishes requiring expensive ingredients and skilled techniques appear prominently in collections intended to impress readers with the sophistication of royal cuisine. More ordinary preparations, these simple roasts and stews that actually fed most people most of the time, received less attention from writers who found them unremarkable. The documentary emphasis on exceptional cooking distorts our understanding of what kitchen workers actually produced. These cinnamon-laden showpieces were occasional highlights, not everyday fare. The career trajectories of royal cooks reveal patterns of mobility and advancement that existed within highly stratified societies. A talented worker who entered a kitchen as a child, performing menial labor, might advance through the ranks over decades to achieve master status. This advancement required not just culinary skill, but political ability. The capacity to navigate household hierarchies, manage relationships with superiors, and avoid the disasters that could end careers regardless of competence. The successful master cook had survived as well as achieved, dodging the numerous threats that could derail advancement at any point. The transfer of cooks between royal households created networks of culinary knowledge that crossed political boundaries. A cook who had served one king might be recruited by another, bringing techniques and recipes that spread through these transfers. These movements weren't always voluntary. Cooks were sometimes gifted or exchanged as part of diplomatic arrangements, their labour becoming a form of tribute or alliance building. The cook who found himself in a new household had to adapt to different preferences, different ingredients, and different administrative systems, while maintaining the expertise that made him valuable in the first place. The training of future cooks was a responsibility that senior kitchen staff took seriously, both from professional pride and practical necessity. An aging master cook who failed to train successors left his household vulnerable. When he died or became unable to work, there would be no one to replace him. The apprenticeship system ensured continuity, transmitting knowledge from one generation to the next through direct observation and guided practice. The best masters were also effective teachers, able to articulate their methods in ways that learners could absorb. The competition between royal households for culinary prestige drove innovation and improvement. A king whose feasts were known to be superior to rivals' feasts enjoyed a form of reputation that contributed to political standing. This competition encouraged experimentation with new techniques, new ingredients, and new presentations, including novel uses of cinnamon and refined smoking methods that competitors would then try to replicate. The cuisine evolved through this competitive pressure, with successful innovations spreading rapidly through the network of royal kitchens. The religious calendar's impact on kitchen operations created cyclical patterns of feast and fast that structured the entire year. The elaborate meat-based cuisine that displayed cinnamon and smoke at their finest alternated with austere fish-based preparations during Lent and other fasting periods. The transition between these modes required complete reorganization of kitchen activities, different suppliers, different techniques, different personnel in some cases. The kitchen had to be capable of both modes and able to switch between them according to the liturgical calendar. The supply chain challenges during fasting periods were distinct from ordinary operations. Fresh fish was highly perishable and had to be sourced quickly. Preserved fish might sustain the household through longer fasts, but required advance procurement. The logistics of fish supply often depended on proximity to coasts or rivers, and landlocked courts faced greater difficulties than coastal ones. The cinnamon that enhanced meat preparations wasn't forbidden during fasts, but it had to be deployed differently in fish-based cuisine, finding new applications that complemented rather than clashed with the different base ingredients. The intersection of royal kitchens with urban food systems created economic ripple effects throughout capital cities. The purchasing power of royal households supported merchants, farmers, and suppliers whose livelihoods depended on palace custom. When royal preferences shifted, when a new cook introduced new dishes, or when diplomatic changes affected spice availability, these shifts propagated through urban economies. The kitchen's decisions had consequences far beyond its walls, affecting prices and availability for everyone who shared the same markets. The fire management expertise that kitchens developed through constant work with flame had applications beyond cooking. Kitchen workers who could build, maintain, and control fires of various sizes and temperatures possessed skills that were valuable in other contexts. The same knowledge that produced perfect roasts could produce controlled burns in other settings. The same attention to fire safety that prevented kitchen disasters applied to fire prevention generally. Kitchen expertise circulated into broader household operations through workers who carried their skills beyond their primary assignments. The next part of our story will explore how the cinnamon and smoke cuisine of royal kitchens eventually spread beyond palace walls. How these foods shaped the development of national cuisines, and what happened when the conditions that made royal kitchen culture possible began to change. The feast is reaching its climax, but there's still more to tell. Let's continue. The spread of royal cuisine beyond palace walls happened through multiple channels that gradually eroded the exclusivity of what had been elite food culture. Former royal cooks who retired or were dismissed took their knowledge into private service for noble households, bringing techniques and recipes that trickled down through social hierarchies. Printed cookbooks, beginning in the 15th century, made royal recipes available to anyone who could read and afford the books, democratizing knowledge that had previously been closely held. The spice trade itself became more competitive and less monopolized, bringing cinnamon and other exotic ingredients within reach of wealthy merchants who could now approximate royal cooking in their own homes. The process was gradual enough that contemporaries often didn't notice it happening. What had seemed uniquely royal in one generation became merely aristocratic in the next, then merely wealthy, then merely prosperous. Cinnamon that had once signified global power came to signify merely comfortable means. Smoked meats that had once required royal-scale infrastructure became available from commercial smokehouses serving urban markets. The material basis of royal culinary distinction was progressively undermined by the same commercial forces that had originally supplied royal kitchens. The cookbook revolution of the early modern period accelerated this democratization dramatically. When printed books began circulating recipes that had previously existed only in manuscript or in the memories of trained cooks, the knowledge monopoly that royal kitchens had enjoyed was permanently broken. Anyone who could read could now attempt dishes that had been palace specialties, and while the results might not match royal standards, they introduced ordinary households to flavor profiles and techniques that had been inaccessible. Cinnamon-spiced meat preparations that had impressed kings now appeared on bourgeois tables across Europe. The changing economics of the spice trade was central to this transformation. The Portuguese discovery of sea routes to Asia in the 15th century broke the monopolies that had sustained astronomical spice prices for centuries. Competition among European trading companies drove prices down over subsequent centuries, making spices accessible to populations that had never tasted them before. Cinnamon, while still valuable, ceased to be the marker of extraordinary wealth it had once been. The flavour remained distinctive, but its social meaning shifted as access broadened. The persistence of smoke as a food technology, even as its necessity diminished, reveals something about how taste preferences work. When refrigeration and modern preservation methods made smoking unnecessary for practical purposes, smoked foods didn't disappear. Instead, they persisted as flavour traditions that people had learned to enjoy and didn't want to abandon. The smoke that had been essential became elective, valued for taste rather than function. Modern smoked salmon, smoked bacon, smoked cheeses. None of these require smoking for preservation, but all benefit from the flavour that smoking adds. Royal kitchen technology became contemporary gourmet tradition. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this exploration of how royal kitchens shaped the food we still eat, how cinnamon and smoke travelled from palace tables to your own, has changed how you think about what's on your plate, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What foods do you eat that carry traces of this history? What flavours connect you to royal traditions you'd never thought about? I read every single comment, and I'm genuinely curious what resonates. The professionalization of cooking outside royal contexts drew heavily on royal kitchen traditions. As restaurants emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, they needed cooks with skills and knowledge that had been developed primarily in aristocratic and royal households. The chefs who staffed early restaurants often had backgrounds in household service, bringing with them the techniques, the standards, and the flavour preferences that had been cultivated in elite kitchens. Restaurant cuisine was essentially royal cuisine, made commercial, available to anyone who could pay the price, rather than only to those born into privilege. The national cuisines that crystallized in the modern era incorporated royal kitchen traditions as foundational elements. French cuisine, the most prestigious European culinary tradition, drew explicitly on the cooking of French royal and aristocratic households. The elaborate sauces, the careful techniques, the emphasis on presentation, all of these reflected standards developed over centuries in elite kitchens. When Escoffier codified French cuisine in the late 19th century, he was systematizing practices that traced their lineage through generations of palace cooks. The cinnamon that had once marked French royal tables had largely faded from the cuisine, replaced by other luxury ingredients, but the underlying approach remained recognizable. When Escoffier codified French cuisine in the late 19th century, he was systematizing practices that traced their lineage through generations of palace cooks. The cinnamon that had once marked French royal tables had largely faded from the cuisine, replaced by other luxury ingredients, but the underlying approach remained recognizable. English cuisine similarly preserved traces of its royal kitchen origins, though the specifics differed from French patterns. The British love of roasted meats, of substantial puddings, of preparations that emphasized quality ingredients, simply, these preferences had roots in the roasting halls of medieval palaces, where smoke and spice had transformed raw materials into royal dining. The Christmas pudding that modern British families serve descends from medieval spiced preparations that required ingredients like cinnamon that were once markers of wealth. The tradition has democratized completely, but the historical connection remains. The American adaptation of European food traditions incorporated royal kitchen influences that arrived with immigrant cooks and immigrant cookbooks. The heavy use of cinnamon in American baking, which might surprise Europeans accustomed to more restrained spicing, reflects the democratized abundance that made formerly precious spices everyday ingredients in the New World. American smoked meats, the barbecue traditions of the South, the smoked fish of the Northeast, the bacon that accompanies every breakfast, continue techniques that royal smokehouses had perfected centuries earlier. The royal has become the vernacular, transformed but recognizable. The global spread of European food traditions through colonialism carried royal kitchen influences to every inhabited continent. Colonial administrators brought their food preferences with them, creating demand for familiar ingredients and familiar preparations in colonial capitals worldwide. Local adaptations emerged as colonial cuisines incorporated indigenous ingredients into European frameworks. But the underlying structure often reflected the elite traditions that colonizers considered proper. Cinnamon, native to Ceylon, returned to South Asia in European culinary forms quite different from indigenous uses. The smoke that had preserved European meats merged with local smoking traditions to create hybrid techniques. The transformation of cinnamon's meaning in global cuisine illustrates the complexity of how royal ingredients spread and changed. In its original South Asian context, cinnamon had culinary and medicinal uses quite different from its European applications. When Europeans incorporated cinnamon into their cooking, they created their own associations and traditions that were then re-exported through colonial expansion. Modern global cinnamon usage reflects all of these layers: indigenous South Asian practices, medieval European adaptations, colonial hybridizations, and contemporary innovations that draw on all preceding traditions. The spice that marked royal power has become truly global, present in cuisines worldwide in forms its original users wouldn't recognize. The industrialization of food production changed the relationship between royal kitchen traditions and ordinary eating in ways that are still working themselves out. Industrial processes can replicate some aspects of royal kitchen technique: the liquid smoke that flavors mass-produced bacon, the standardized spice blends that season processed foods. But they can't replicate the human skill and attention that characterized the best historical cooking. What industry provides is accessibility without excellence. Everyone can have smoked flavor and cinnamon flavor, but few experience these flavors at the level that royal kitchens achieved. The democratization is real, but incomplete. The contemporary revival of interest in historical cooking techniques represents a reaction against industrial food production that echoes royal kitchen values. Artisanal food producers who smoke meats by traditional methods, bakeries that use cinnamon as medieval cooks did, restaurants that attempt to recreate historical flavor profiles, all of these draw on royal kitchen heritage even when they don't explicitly acknowledge it. The craft food movement is, in some sense, an attempt to recapture excellence that industrial production sacrificed for accessibility. Royal kitchen standards, long abandoned by mainstream food production, find new life in specialized niches. The knowledge systems that supported royal cooking have been partially preserved in culinary education. Modern cooking schools teach techniques that descend from royal kitchen practice, transmitting skills through structured instruction rather than the informal apprenticeship of earlier eras. The standardization of culinary education has made certain techniques more widely accessible, but has also arguably flattened regional and traditional variations that informal transmission had maintained. The master cooks of royal kitchens knew things that no culinary school teaches. Tacit knowledge lost when the last bearers died without adequately training successors. The equipment that modern kitchens use reflects royal kitchen innovations even when users don't recognize the connection. The roasting oven that replaced the open hearth, the dedicated spaces for different cooking operations, the separation of preparation and cooking areas, all of these design principles were developed in large-scale operations like royal kitchens before spreading to domestic and commercial contexts. The equipment has evolved enormously, but the underlying logic of kitchen organization still reflects patterns established centuries ago in palace cooking operations. The food safety practices that modern regulations require have parallels in royal kitchen procedures developed for different but related reasons. The careful tracking of ingredients, the separation of raw and cooked foods, the attention to temperature control. Royal kitchens developed versions of these practices out of concern for poison prevention and food quality rather than bacterial contamination, but the resulting procedures addressed similar risks. Modern food safety has scientific foundations that medieval cooks lacked, but the behavioral patterns share common ancestry. The social meanings of elaborate cooking have shifted dramatically from royal contexts, but haven't disappeared entirely. Hosting an impressive dinner party still signals resources and taste. Serving well-prepared food still creates social bonds. Mastering complex recipes still represents a form of cultural capital. What has changed is the relationship between cooking skill and social class. In royal contexts, the cook was a servant whose skill enhanced his master status, while in contemporary contexts, cooking skill can be a direct source of status for whoever possesses it. The work of cooking has been partially destigmatized, even as it remains associated with service in professional contexts. The environmental implications of food traditions that originated in royal kitchens are now subjects of serious concern. The meat-heavy cuisine that royal kitchens epitomized, with its elaborate smoked preparations and spice-laden presentations, has environmental costs that medieval cooks never considered. The global spice trade that brings cinnamon to every supermarket has ecological and social justice dimensions that complicate enjoyment of these flavors. The democratization of royal food traditions has spread their environmental impact across billions of consumers rather than concentrating it among a privileged few. The abundance that makes royal flavors accessible also makes their aggregate impact enormous. The future of cooking in traditions descended from royal kitchens is uncertain in ways that would have been unimaginable to medieval master cooks. Climate change threatens supply chains for ingredients like cinnamon. Alternative proteins challenge meat-centered cuisine. Automation transforms the labor of cooking in ways that may make human skill less central. The traditions that evolved over centuries in palace kitchens now face disruptions as profound as any in their history. How much of what we learned from royal cooking will persist, and how much will be displaced by approaches better suited to changed circumstances remains to be seen. The preservation of food knowledge across generations has always been precarious, and our current moment may be more precarious than most. The tacit knowledge that master cooks passed to apprentices doesn't survive if the transmission is interrupted, and many food traditions have been interrupted by wars, migrations, and social upheavals. The documentation that modern food writing provides is valuable but incomplete. Some things can only be learned through practice under expert guidance, and experts in certain traditions are becoming rare. The royal kitchen knowledge that survived into the present day could still be lost if we're not careful about maintaining it. What the story of royal kitchens ultimately reveals is how food connects everything: politics and economics, technology and culture, labor and pleasure, the local and the global. A dish flavored with cinnamon and touched by smoke carries within it traces of trade networks spanning oceans, labor systems organizing thousands of workers, knowledge traditions passed through countless hands. The king who ate such a dish was consuming not just food, but a demonstration of power that depended on systems too complex for any individual to fully comprehend. And we, eating descendants of those dishes today, participate in systems equally complex that our own comprehension barely touches. The cinnamon sits in your spice rack, probably purchased from a supermarket, its journey from a Sri Lankan hillside to your kitchen invisible and unremarkable. The smoked bacon in your refrigerator carries flavor profiles developed over centuries of refinement, techniques that began in palace smokehouses, now replicated in industrial facilities. The knowledge of how to combine these flavors, the recipes you follow, the intuitions you've developed, descends through chains of transmission that connect you to cooks you'll never know in kitchens you'll never see. Royal cooking hasn't disappeared. It's become so thoroughly integrated into ordinary practice that we've forgotten it was ever special. The hearth fire that heated medieval palace kitchens has been replaced by gas burners and electric ranges. But the fundamental work continues, transforming raw materials into nourishment, creating pleasure through skilled manipulation of ingredients, feeding people in ways that satisfy more than simple hunger. The cooks who sweated over royal feasts would recognize what you're doing when you cook, even if the specifics would confuse them. The tradition continues, changed beyond recognition, and yet somehow still the same. And with that, our story concludes. The smoke has cleared, the cinnamon has been put away, and the feast is over. Thank you for spending these hours exploring how royal kitchens shaped the food traditions we inherit, often without knowing it. The next time you taste cinnamon or smoke, perhaps you'll think of the palace cooks who made these flavors fit for kings, and of the long journey those flavors traveled to reach your own table. Until next time, cook well, eat well, and remember, every meal is a connection to history.